I'm honored to speak at a university whose motto is pray and work. It's pretty close to the one I had as an entrepreneur, so for 20 years my motto was pray it will work. First, my congratulations. As the president mentioned, your degree is a big deal. This is your day, not mine. And at worst, a commencement speaker is all that stands between you and lunch. But at best, hopefully for the next 10 minutes or so, I could give you something to really think about as you embark on the next chapter in your life. You know, when I was thinking about the speech, I wondered what I would have said to a group of graduates living on the edge of a revolution the day writing was invented, or the day or the year after Gutenberg printed the first book. Or what would I have said when radio reached into the homes of millions? What advice would I have given to those who were about to enter a world no one had ever experienced? I want you to think about this, because whether you like it or not, or know it or not, you're all coming of age at just that same extraordinary time in human development. So let me be honest about my bias before I start. I love technology. As you've heard, I've spent my life in the center of innovation in Silicon Valley. I did 8 startups in 21 years, and I've spent the last 15 years in academia teaching others innovation and entrepreneurship. I was present at the creation of the first microprocessors. I participated in the PC revolution. I built video games and shipped software on the first internet browsers. And I've watched how in the blink of an eye, technology went from products used by the very few to ending up in the pockets of billions of people, bringing social change and corporate disruption. But I have to tell you, nothing, absolutely nothing I've experienced will come close to what you're about to see in your lives. Because only a few generations have been granted the role of determining whether a revolution in communications will allow our better angels or our darker angels to win. You leave here today with an incredible opportunity, but also with an immense responsibility. Half the world now owns a smartphone. On an average day, all of you will look at your phone over 200 times. Some of you are dying to look at them right now. You've gone through college, interacting with your friends, and connecting to the world using Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and Snapchat and Twitter and even Tinder and Pandora and Pinterest and Uber and YouTube and other apps I don't even know. And I bet I don't care to either. Living phone forward and connecting to the world through this software seems normal to you. You communicate, interact, and network with each other in a way that's unique in the history of our species. Faster, with infinitely more data, in shorter bursts, with more connection to people and places. And what's interesting is we now know the way we consume information actually changes our brains. Whether these new forms of communication physically change our gray matter or just cause us to use different parts of it, that's still open to debate. But what's not open to debate is our brains process information differently depending on the form of communication we're engaged in. Your brains have been rewired to process all this net-based information. Your brains are dealing with the world in a different way than humans ever have. It's a big idea. This profound shift has only occurred 6 times in the 200,000-year history of Homo sapiens. And you here today are the vanguard of the 7th wave. Each time this happened, the human race made major leaps forward. But your generation, all of you graduating today, are our unintended science experiment. And the question is whether we've given you a gift or whether we've given you a curse. Let's look what happened the 6 other times our brains got rewired. If some of you remember from an anthropology class, modern humans emerged about 200,000 years ago, and with them, spoken language. For the next 195,000 years, we passed information on to each other via stories. You sat by a fire, looked at the stars, and listened to a storyteller recount creation myths, hero myths, and stories for entertainment. And it was your imagination that was engaged as you filled in the details. Over thousands of years, these storytellers rewired their own brains into something very, very different from those who were simply listening. Storytellers trained to memorize outrageously long narratives, more than most humans alive today can. Storytellers had new brains. After more than 100,000 years of telling stories, something unprecedented happened. A few merchants in the Mideast created writing, at first to keep track of crops. Now I got to stop here and remind the university audience that some of the oldest written inscriptions were not only about crops, but also about the celebration of beer. So we started at the beginning. With written text, the minds of the readers required a whole new way of processing information. We first had to learn how to read and then how to understand what the words were trying to tell us. Readers and writers of language had new brains. The written word also meant that information could now be standardized, and our better angels blossomed. We could formalize laws, we could create religious texts, and we could communicate orders to coordinate activities farther than the spoken word could travel. And written language enabled the creation of large societies and with them governments. But our darker angels, they also found a way to use the written word to dominate and oppress others. But in 1440, Gutenberg rocked the world when he invented the printing press. Until the middle of the 15th century, most people couldn't read. The mass production of books changed that. Within 50 years in Europe, books created an information explosion, tens of thousands of titles, and tens of millions of copies of books. Our better angels soared, and printed books became the internet of the Renaissance. Readers of books had new brains. And mass production of printed books fueled the reconfiguration of our society, not just our brains. With the printing press, it only took a couple of months to spread Martin Luther's 95 Theses over much of Northern Europe. The result was the Protestant Reformation, which ushered in a new era of political, intellectual, and cultural change. But at the same time, our darker angels were frightened by the free and unfettered access to information, and they banned books. And they also burned heretics that challenged church and state dogma. Now, it took 2 centuries from the appearance of the book to the emergence of what we would now call newspapers. And newspapers meant mass communication had arrived. The first weekly newspapers appeared in Italy and Germany and quickly spread throughout Europe. And what's interesting to note is in Canada, the first newspaper was here in Halifax, 1752. That's where you applaud. I think they're still printing the same news. But by the end of the 19th century, mass circulation papers had developed the characteristics that your parents would recognize. Headlines, illustrations, entertaining stories, but they were all designed to shortcut critical thinking and to stir passion and emotion to sell newspapers and, of course, advertising. So now newspaper readers had a daily or weekly stream of what we now call clickbait headlines. Readers of newspapers had new brains. The next wave was radio. It gave us instantaneous communication to national audiences, and advertisers immediately figured out how to turn those engaged audiences into consumers. And some governments learned how to turn radio into a weapon of mass deception. Radio meant we could now hear the voice of the storytellers again. As our brains were newly engaged, our imaginations were required to translate spoken words into mental pictures. And believe it or not, listeners of radio had to get new brains. It wasn't more than 30 years from the widespread radio and that television came onto the scene. TV was something different. It was a lot more than just radio with voices. TV allowed our better angels to shine a light into homes and battlefields across the world. It changed for better how we viewed race, gender, and class. But our darker angels, they dimmed our imagination. We could gaze all evening and disengage our brains. Viewers of television now had new, and for the first time, slightly diminished brains. Now, for a decade, the phrase "as seen on TV" sold as many products as it obliterated much critical thinking. And not only does this work for commercial products, but in some places it also extended to politicians. A handsome, young, telegenic politician could capture a country. And that brings us to today. I don't have to explain the internet to you. You live it, you're immersed in it, but let me take a minute to contrast it to the world I grew up in. I spent my first 17 years in a city where there were just 3 major TV channels, 3 major newspapers, and believe it or not, no internet. If I wanted to look something up, I had to physically walk a mile and go to a library. If I wanted to connect with a friend, I had to use something called a hardwired telephone on a desk, or pay for each call by physically putting money in a booth outside. And that was in New York City. The rest of the world had much, much less. The net is like we invented writing, the printing press, radio, and TV all in the same decade. That's the world you're all graduating into, immersed in social media with infinite facts and continuous news. The 7th wave of communication and brain wiring has arrived. You all think differently and process things differently from your parents, grandparents, and any other humans that have ever lived. When each of the other 6 waves arrived, the early adopters were the more agile outliers. But ultimately, governments and companies figured out how to master the new technology, and individuals lost, as the power of the state and the power of profit controlled the new media. Unfortunately, the same is now true for the internet. Today, China, Russia, North Korea, and other countries have locked their citizens behind the Great Firewall. They control what their citizens can read and access. Yet at the same time, Facebook, Google, and Twitter, and the rest of social media capture more personal information about you than any government security agency, except their goal is to profit from your presence. So what does this all mean for you? Well, you've been in a university where information distribution in your classroom, if you've noticed, was not a democracy. There were voices of expertise and authority, and you had certified data providers called professors. You didn't vote on whether you believed what you were taught. In fact, you were graded on how well you understood it. But you're about to enter a very different world. It's nothing like the university you've been in. You won't have such certainty. Let me give you an example of the 4 challenges you're going to face in a 24/7 internet world on a personal level, as a citizen, and in your career. Challenge 1. You deal in streams of short-form information, 140 characters, pictures and messages that disappear, instantaneous communication. The question you all need to think about is how are you going to deal with issues that are more complex than sound bites and require deep dives? Think about that. Number 2 is every generation had to deal with fake news, deliberate misinformation spread by storytelling, books, newspapers, and TV. It had different names in different times: yellow journalism, propaganda, misinformation. But unlike previous generations, fake news today is like a social disease. You catch it from your friends. And the feeling of validity that comes from hearing something from someone you know makes social media much more powerful than what you ever saw on TV or read in a newspaper. In your generation, Facebook is one of the leading sources of fake news. And that's a shame, because Facebook is not, believe it or not, a news source. It doesn't originate news. It's just a distributor of news, And it's designed to get you to spend time on their site, click on their ads, and gather your personal information. Worse, today, Associated Press and Bloomberg already have bots, automated programs that write sports stories and earning reports, all done by computer. Soon, machines will make the news by optimizing stories for clicks. And before long, computers are actually going to create fake videos, and we won't be able to tell the difference between what was created by a human and what was created by a computer. And so you need to think about this as you leave. What kind of skills will you need to operate in a world of real and fake manufactured data coming from your friends? Will you vote for people who value facts, or will you vote for people who manufacture them? Will you let the darker angels win as you add fire to the flame, or will you seek out and spread real news? Third thing to think about is we've all become digital junkies. Information consumption and engagement with social media means these platforms have become your emotional drug dealers. Likes and thumbs up and posting on social media, gotta admit, it's addictive. And at times, it's like a chemical dependency. They provide immediate rewards after each interaction. They prey on our natural fear of missing out, of either the moment or the event. And your sense of identity and values are now validated by a crowd instantaneously. Now, we have research showing that talking about your views generates more emotional rewards than actually listening to conflicting views. And this becomes a self-reinforcing system because we tend to seek out other sources of information and people that support our own worldview. But this creates a very polarized world. Now, addiction has been with us forever. It's one of our perpetual dark angels. You're all going to need a purpose-driven life to survive in a world where social media is monetizing both your emotions and your time looking at ads. So fourth and finally, the thing to think about is the net has the power to pull us apart as well as to bring us together. Each wave in the last 200,000 years, storytelling, writing, books, newspapers, radio, TV, and now the net, started with the optimistic view that if we could just communicate faster and more efficiently, we would bring out the better angels of our nature. We could be more cohesive. We could be smarter. We could learn new things that would help us make the world a better place. Now, you should all feel great. All those things happen. Yet, at each step forward, our darker angels found a way to use these tools too. But in spite of that, the human race today is a better place than in any time in human history. Every advancement in our capabilities to communicate gave us the ability to reject a world dominated by violence and ignorance. And in exchange, we chose a world where knowledge and cooperation drove civilization forward. Now, most revolutions are not obvious when they happen. When the first scribe wrote on a tablet, no one stood around and said, "This is the day everything changes." When the first Bible came off Gutenberg's press, no one said, "There will be billions of these." I don't believe any of you would exchange places with any other generation. But the question you all should be asking is whether you'll tell your children that this decade was the beginning of a new dark age, or this was the time that something new and wonderful happened and you were part of it, when the internet and social media allowed us to work faster and more collaboratively, when scientific discoveries and technology breakthroughs were integrated into the fabric of society faster than they've ever been before, and when the speed of how business operated and changed forever. So now, graduates of 2017, turn back on your phones and light a path for the better angels. The world is counting on you. Thank you very much.